hello, and welcome everyone. Bruchim habayim. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Goברין. I'm a psychoanalyst and a member of Tel Aviv Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. I write about psychoanalytic knowledge and its history. With me today, my partner, Sharon Ziv. Hello, Sharon.
Hi, good to be here.
And here in Betipulnet, we host prominent figures in psychotherapy to know more about their thoughts and psychoanalytic vision. לפני שאנחנו מתחילים, אנחנו רוצים להזכיר שביום שבת בשעה 8:30 בערב נארח את האומנית מיכל אימן, וב3 ביוני בשעה 7 נארח את שוקי דורבן ונעמי הולר, שידברו על הנושא חוזרים לקליניקה, טיפול בילדים בזמן קורונה. שני האירועים כבר מופיעים בבטיפולנט ואפשר להירשם אליהם. So, let's start. The early 20th century was a time where many psychodynamic therapists began to doubt psychoanalytic truth. And the relational approach was a leading player in encouraging these doubts. Among these truths was the importance of the psychoanalytic contract, what we call now agreement on the setting. In this agreement, we include topics like duration of sessions, frequency of sessions, payment, policy concerning missed sessions, and so on. The contract was perceived as necessary for both patient and analyst. It is good for the patient because it conveys the message that therapy is a serious business, and that if you want therapy, you should make time for it. And also, you should secure financial resources to pay the fees. But it is also good for the analyst. The analyst who is working very hard on trying to overcome resistance must know that the patient will come again in her regular hours, and that she, the analyst, does not have to worry about payment. It is secured by the contract. These recommendations were given by Freud in his technical papers. So the contract provides both analyst and patient a peace of mind. Expectations are clear, and there is no ambiguity. Many thought and still think that if a patient cannot commit to pay on time or to come to regular planned sessions, she's not fit to be a patient, and therapists were most likely not to accept patients of this sort. Today we host Tony Bass, who will present a different view. Together with Tony, we would like to explore topics like the setting, money arrangements, process and content, and the unconscious. And also the corona crisis, which undermined the setting. The traumatic reality of the virus decided for us therapists that the picture does not fit the frame. And we will discuss this with Tony too. As we speak, you are all invited to ask questions through the chat. We will do our best to present your questions to our guests. And now I would like to present Tony. Anthony Tony Bass is an associate professor and supervising analyst at the NYU postdoctoral program in New York City, where he was for many years a chairperson of the relational track. In addition, he is a training and supervising analyst and on the teaching faculty of the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research and the Department of Psychiatry. He was a founding editor and for many years joint editor-in-chief Psychoanalytic Dialogues, the international journals of relational perspectives. He teaches study groups and clinical seminars and workshops on the therapy relationship, on conscious communication between therapist and patient, and on forensics contribution to therapeutic technique. Hello, Tony. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for being interested in having me think about this stuff with you.
Tony, there was a time that many psychoanalysts thought that psychotic patients cannot undergo treatment. Now we don't think that anymore. But many analysts do believe that if the patient cannot commit to the setting arrangement, which is quite basic, you know, pay on time, schedule meetings, don't be late, session ends after 50 minutes, and if someone cannot do this, he or she is not fit to be part of the analytic process, and he or she is untreatable, like the old psychotic patients. Do you think that your account opens the gate to analysis for these patients?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I also think that I would be surprised that many people would actually disagree with that, at least in a private discussion with their colleagues or with their analyst or with their supervisor. I think that these constructs that you put forward as in some way standard procedure or in some way the truth of the matter. I don't think that people work that way. I think that even the more classical analysts, if people got to read my paper on the frame in the discussion that included Glenn Gabbard's response to my paper and my response to Glenn Gabbard, who's a quite classical analyst, but even he said that these are long buried concepts, even among traditional analysts, which I wouldn't go quite so far to say that people are not informed in some way or see those capacities on the patient's part as a kind of aspirational notion. But you know, I've been doing analysis for 40 plus years, and you know, the idea that patients who don't pay on time or who are not prompt to sessions are not able to make use of analysis and to get something out of it seems to me to be, you know, patently not so. And I think, you know, there is a way, and I'm sure that everybody here, how many people are here now?
384.
Yeah, I would be surprised if 50 of the 384 people in this room showed up promptly for all of their analytic sessions, or always paid on time, or obeyed the so-called, you know, basic rules all the time. I don't think that's the way human beings function. Even someone as prominent as Sharon is a later, as she said, although maybe not to her analytic sessions. But you know, I think that there has been a kind of a gap between certain ideas about what constitutes standard practice in psychoanalysis and conditions in the actual field of work and transference, countertransference. Worked for many years with a patient, quite successful in his professional life, active and rich life. But for the first 2 or 3 years of treatment, and it wasn't his first treatment, he would come quite late, 15 minutes late, 20, 25 minutes late. And he told me that in his first analysis, he came always exactly on time because he was fearful of the analyst and experienced the analyst as quite rigid, and reminded him very much of his very strict father. And he would come regularly, 3 times a week, quite late. And we did develop the idea that he came for as much of the session as he felt able to tolerate and to make use of. And you know, 3 or so years into the analysis, he usually used the whole session. But I think had he been deemed by me unable to, you know, unsuitable for analysis or unanalyzable as a function these fairly dramatic parameters that he initiated. I think it would have been unfortunate for both of us, because I think we both got a lot out of that work.
Mm-hmm. Tony?
We're talking about patient that the initial contract, they try to negotiate with it. For example, the patient you talked about in your paper, that you don't know when she will come, and you are willing to reduce her payment, and you don't know if she will come today or she won't come today. You know, that the first patient you described in your paper.
Yeah. Well, that's
how many therapists would be willing to work with these kind of arrangement?
Well, I don't know, and I think I don't think that I would be willing to take on that particular challenge now, at this stage in my career. I think we all change over time, and I think sometimes younger analysts are more experimental. They can be more flexible because they may have more time. They may not be as busy. They're learning. They're trying things out. I think, in that case, I felt interested in seeing if I could help this person. And the contract wasn't exactly as you stated it. The contract was, for people who may not have had a chance to read it, I hope you will, was that this person who came for a consultation was an addict in recovery, and she had been an addict of drugs and alcohol and debt, and she had very serious difficulties and had nearly died, and had gotten herself into all kinds of trouble. But she was also somebody who when she was functioning well, functioned extremely well. So she had very successful businesses, had made and lost great deals of money. She was capable of functioning very well, except when she was in the throes of an addiction. And so the contract that evolved in this particular, sort of co-established arrangement that she and I worked toward making possible for both of us was that her belief was that since she was a debtor and an addict in that way, she considered that to be one of her addictions. She felt that to owe money to the analyst was a slippery slope, and because she was in recovery, it would be similar to an alcoholic being persuaded she could take just one drink, and she felt that to owe money to me would endanger both of us. And so the arrangement we made was that because, in her view, even writing a check at the end of the month was a form of debt, because she would have owed me for all of the sessions that she had that month. And therefore, she was at risk for debting, and I was at risk for colluding with the debt. She really initiated the idea that she would pay me for each session, and that if she was, quote, tapped out, if she couldn't afford to pay me for a session, she wouldn't come. But as it turned out, as it unfolded, that never happened. That as the treatment began, because she was in an increasingly more solidified state, she had the money and increased the hours over time. And as I said in the piece, some years into the treatment, that particular frame was relaxed, and she could accept a bill at the end of the month in a more ordinary way that we do. So I was not putting myself in a position at that time where I felt threatened that I was going to lose so much. I understood that it was possible that if she ran into trouble again, that the treatment might founder, but it wasn't a situation in which I was worried about, being owed thousands of dollars by a patient, who was sort of enacting that kind of problem with the animals. Yeah.
Micha from the audience reflected that, to his opinion, you are minimizing the revolution, the relational revolution, which you are one of mobilizer, and that still and yet in many therapeutic processes, there is kind of rigidness or kind of a lot of occupation around if patients have to pay when the analyst is in a vacation. In the last few weeks, there was a big discussion around this issue in Facebook groups in Israel. And it's still an issue. So if you can relate to that. And another question is from me, the concept of the frame. When you first thought about it, and why we thought the analytic language need this concept of the frame in addition to other concepts like setting or contract, or what is the frame?
Well, I think that there had been a tradition in psychoanalysis, at least in the United States. I'll answer your question first and then try to get to the second question. You may have to refresh my memory about it.
Okay.
But I think there had been a sort of a tradition in which the psychoanalytic frame, as it was called, had become, I think, somewhat fetishized, with notions about what constituted a psychoanalysis as distinct from psychotherapy, let's say, and in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, psychoanalysis was considered, the sort of pure gold of psychotherapy, the most advanced and the most serious and the most significant. And there was a kind of elitism, that developed around psychoanalysis and who could make use of it, and much of that discussion was organized around this idea of, as Einar said, of who could abide by the rules of the game, by the sort of defining features of what made psychoanalysis, and at least in the United States, that had to do with coming 4 times a week and lying on the couch and so on, 15-minute hours, and a certain level of functioning within the frame of treatment, and I think as the other question touched on, and as Einar, am I saying your name right, Einar? How do you say your name?
Yes, Einar. Great.
Yeah, and as Einar said, I think from quite early on in the history of psychoanalysis, there were other points of view, represented especially by Ferenczi and those who followed his thought, both in Europe and the United States. But they were really out of the mainstream of psychoanalysis as it was self-defined. And I think, Ferenczi was an initiator of the idea that as a psychoanalyst, we're here to help patients, to learn more and to improve our method so that it could be most helpful to patients who would want to come and see us. And so Ferenczi was really the first who played with this kind of idea of an elasticity of the frame, you know, a way of moving it to suit and accommodate what a patient could make use of, rather than to see psychoanalysis as a kind of Procrustean bed in which if someone doesn't fit into it, we either have to kind of chop off the limbs so that they can fit, or tell them to go see somebody else. So I think, you know, my work on the frame really was responding to some of the rigidities in the field at that point, represented by some prominent ego analysts like Robert Langs, who I mentioned in the paper, who had very, you know, kind of strict constructions of what constituted analysis, what one needed to do as a patient and as an analyst. And I think as part of the you know, emerging emphasis on intersubjectivity and a two-person perspective rather than a one-person perspective, you know, a relational model rather than a drive model, there was a sense that you know, the analyst isn't exactly like the boss. You know, the analyst is a collaborator. And so in that collaboration, various kinds of negotiations take place. It's interesting what you say about certain features of each person's preferred way of working. We don't have to call it the frame, but you know, because I think that each therapist is a unique person, as is each patient, and so you know, the particular picture that emerges in an interaction between a patient and a therapist is I think much more specific to each psyche and you know, the way it's expressing itself at any given time in a treatment, in a career, in a life, and so I was struck by what you said about your discussion about things like charging fees for missed sessions, because typically that's something that I do. You know, I prefer to charge a fee for a missed session, not because I think it's more helpful to the patient or that it you know, it establishes a certain kind of commitment or responsibility for the patient, but really because I like to have you know, to have a kind of stable sense of my income, you know, and so it's a certain number of hours that I book a week for my paid work, you know, my clinical work in psychoanalysis. I have other work that I do that's pro bono or that I charge very little for, and supervision at analytic institutes and so on. So for those hours that I regard as my money-making hours, I like to be paid for it. And so I let patients know that that's how I prefer to work. And sometimes patients don't like it. They're curious about it. I tell them how I think about it. And the interesting thing about it is that in recent years, patients have really understood it. You know, that they've really understood that you know, if I'm seeing a patient 4 times a week and or 3, and a couple of those patients are out on a business trip, that constitutes a quite substantial part of my income, and so I don't want to put myself in that position of not knowing what my income is in any given time, and typically patients, have gotten it and have signed on. Recently, a patient, expressed, he was kind of amused by it. He's an analyst himself, and he said, "I can't believe you, a relational analyst, does that. I know back in the old days when I was starting out and everybody was Freudian, that was a kind of standard practice, and he took it almost with a kind of an amused surprise, that someone with my background and sort of reputation had that attitude about money. But I find these things to be very much a kind of personal preference, and in certain milieus, people operate differently.
Tony, just if you can, before Anna goes with another outline, I would like to ask if you can, if the rules are not the essential ingredients of the frame, so what are the essential ingredients for an analytic process to take place? What make it? What is the deeper frame?
You mean the sort of internal frame that the analyst carries?
What are the vestitudes? What are the essential ingredients that are needed for a process to take place if it's not the setting or the rules?
Well, I think that that's a really interesting, complicated question, because I think that being an analyst and being oriented toward helping a patient to sort of enrich their experience through thinking about their experience and feeling more about their experience and using the presence of another person who's listening carefully and who's orienting as sort of carefully and thoughtfully as I can to what their experience is and the meaning that they're making out of it. I tend to think of really all of my patients in one in one way or another as analytic patients for me. That as a function of they're coming to see me, they're telling me their story, they're trying to think with me about their story in a kind of deeper and deeper and sort of fuller way that enriches their experience. So for me, whether I'm seeing a patient 4 times a week and that patient is using the couch, or I'm seeing someone once or twice a week or 4 times a week and they're sitting up, I think of the work that I do at my office as analysis, and I don't really make a fine distinction. I mean, I have patients who come 4 times a week and lie on the couch who I think are working less deeply than a patient who might be coming twice a week and sitting up. And yet we're always kind of moving, I think, toward trying to establish a kind of deeper meaning and more access to what is being felt and what is being experienced. So I think, again, that's something that analysts of different persuasions and from different backgrounds have quite different views of. When I first started to teach at the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training, that's a very, about 12 years ago, that's a very classical institute in the United States, one of the most prominent classical institutes in the United States. And they asked me to come to teach there because they wanted to hear about relational psychoanalysis from the horse's mouth. Like a lot of classical institutes, in the last 10 or 20 years as relational psychoanalysis has offered so much. There are people teaching relational psychoanalysis at classical institutes who don't really practice relational psychoanalysis. And at a certain point, the institute students were asking, well, what would a relational analyst do under such and such a circumstance? And at a certain point, they said, well, let's get one. Let's invite Tony Bass to teach. And at that time, if treatment was not at least 4 days a week and on the couch, it wasn't analysis, and candidates would get no credit for any treatment that wasn't conducted that way. It was very clear. You're here to train as an analyst. That means everything that you do that informs your training is 4 times a week or 5 on the couch. And in the last 10 years, that's changed. It's relaxed. They're now crediting work that candidates are doing that at fewer than 4 times a week and that are not on the couch as part of their analytic hours. They're becoming more flexible in their view of the frame as they're becoming sort of more informed about relational thought. Recently they asked me to be a training and supervising analyst there, which is a remarkable thing for a relational analyst to be in that position at one of the classical bastions. So I think it's really, I think people's sort of feelings about, how we sort of define what psychoanalysis is have changed quite a lot. Although, as we know, in Freud's original definition that Anya mentioned before, in those early technique papers, he did say, that these particular, bastions, that frames of reference that I'm talking about, use of the couch 4 times a week, he did say in that paper that those are my personal preferences. I'm not comfortable having someone look at me for hours on end. I find it a strain, I personally don't like it. And I realize that other analysts will have different preferences, to express themselves differently. They'll have a different therapeutic aesthetic, and in my view, Dr. Freud said, if the analyst is oriented toward transference and resistance, that's good enough for me. I would call that an analysis, yes, even if the analyst had his own way of doing things that was, different from mine.
Let me just get back to the patient we just discussed. I think she was lucky to meet you. I think she was lucky to meet you because I don't, and you also say that today you're not sure that you have taken her to treatment. And I think not many therapists would have agreed to such arrangement, because you would say that if you cannot commit to come, if you cannot make a commitment to come on regular hours, then I'm not sure that you are ready for treatment. Then I'm not sure that you are committed to the entire treatment and that you understand what is it all about. And in these circumstances, I'm not sure that I can treat, that I can make a treatment here and I can make a commitment to you.
Yeah.
And I think most therapists will find it very, very difficult to accept such an arrangement.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I would find that very unfortunate myself. We could take a poll on chat and see how many people feel the way you feel. I think, to me, I'm offering myself to be helpful to a patient, and I don't really want to put too fine a point on the question of whether what that patient can make use of would be called analysis or not by somebody else.
Yes.
Or not. So, but I think the idea of turning away a patient because they can't accommodate to my particular notion of what my form of treatment is part of what gave psychoanalysis a bad name, in a way. There's something so elitist about that. And I would be much more inclined, as I was with this patient, to we'll give it a try. Typically that's what I do anyway. When I'm doing a consultation with a patient, my sense is let's meet for a few sessions or a month and see if this feels like something that would be helpful to you and useful to you. So I think if I started out with some, sort of pre-baked definition of what someone would have to be able to do or commit to before I even began to meet with the person and see what it felt like, I think that a lot of patients who could make use of any one of us would be turned away. And as I said in the paper, I have treated at least a half a dozen people in the course of my career, probably many more, but I can think of a half a dozen offhand, who had been deemed unanalyzable. And actually many of them were in our field. Many of them were people who, when they were in graduate school, had gone to, the clinic at New York Psychoanalytic, someplace like that, and applied for training, an analytic experience there in the course of their doctoral training. They were told that they were unsuitable for analysis. And it left, tremendous scars on them, sometimes for decades, in terms of what that had felt like to be sort of turned away as somehow not making the grade. And my experience of them in their analysis with me was that they were able to make excellent use of analysis. So I think that was an unfortunate expression in psychoanalysis in the early days that I hope we've mostly gotten over. And it's what Ferenczi was known for. For all, I'm a huge proponent of Ferenczi's way of thinking about things. And in his day, he, you see this in the clinical diary, if you've read it, that in Ferenczi was the guy that the Freud and the other analysts would send patients to if they found them too difficult to work with. He was considered to be the analyst of last resort. Like if you couldn't, if Ferenczi couldn't help you, nobody could help you. But he was as much of an analyst as anybody, and he developed the idea of an elastic frame that could move and shift in relation to tensions from both sides. And I think that's how I try to conduct myself.
Yes, let me just tell you something about the Israeli psychoanalytic community. We have a huge relational community, but we also have a huge classical analyst community who are very, very influential. Yeah. And so I'm not sure that they heard about all these contemporary radical new arrangement that you're so familiar with and that and is widespread in American culture.
Yeah, I don't think of myself as radical. And someone I think said earlier that I seemed not as radical as they thought I might.
That you seem that you are more radical than you feel now.
Yes.
Say again. That I'm what?
That the audience feel you more radical than you think that you are.
Oh, more radical than I think that I am.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's contextual, right?
Okay.
I think that we all exist on some sort of a complex continuum, right? For example, my patients who are in the field who are amazed that I would charge for a missed session, think, how could Bass charge for a missed session? That seems so old-fashioned and conservative. But I think the place where I'm coming from, it is not. I mean, it has to do with an expression of my particular needs and subjectivities, and you know, and there were times, as in this paper, when you know, under the sort of press or under the sort of pressure of what was emerging from my partner in analysis, I moved it, and we made other arrangements somewhat. But as I said, I think that also is something that we, you know, we're changing, we evolve, we try certain ways of working and being out. We sometimes we make an exception because of something that we feel when we're with somebody that we would like to help. So I don't know whether that's you know, I think, as I said in the discussion of Phil Bromberg's reaction to my paper, I think you know, we all operate in different ways out of different self states in response to what's evoked in us over time with the patient or when we meet with the patient. So I think none of us are you know, so exactly consistent all the time in the way that we work.
Yes, let me just ask you about Philip Bromberg's response to your paper, which he basically agrees with you, but he said, and I quote, "I have discovered that even with patients for whom the need for adaptation is strongest, an attempt to provide adaptation in a way that seems to disavow the analyst's own self-interest eventually escalates the enactment." Mm-hmm. And what he said also is that the difference between him and you, a slight difference, he defined it, is that he draws the line.
Yeah.
What for him is non-negotiable.
Yeah. Well, but he also said, you know, Philip Bromberg, you know, has been a very important mentor of mine. I was in supervision with him in analytic training, and then for 15 or 20 years after, until we finally decided to make it a peer supervision, and then had another 15 or 20 years together in a peer supervision. So this was, you know, we've spoken for thousands and thousands of hours about this stuff. And you know, I've learned a tremendous amount from Philip. But he also said, you know, in a characteristic Brombergian way in that discussion, that, you know, in a certain self-state, he draws a line in the sand, but then it might change in a different self-state, right? So, you know, in the moment in which he sort of gets into that state where it might express itself in some way as my way or the highway, most particularly in his writing, you see that kind of thing occurs when he's in a kind of state of his own shame and his own anxiety, and so certain kinds of enactments unfold, and but then he also said he then in sort of working through those enactments, not atypically finds himself in a different place where suddenly the so-called line in the sand changes, and something relaxes, or in Manny Gent's terms, it might move into something that looks more like a kind of surrender on the part of either the analyst or the patient, rather than a submission. And I think what he was writing about there was really sort of warning against a submission on the part of the analyst, you know, a kind of giving in to something that the analyst. But he would certainly, you know, say, and has written about the kind of rocky roads that he's found himself on in difficult transference moments in which he becomes, you know, stubborn and steamed up and angry before something allows him and the patient to get to some other side of it.
Yes. So I think that do you have can you see a scenario where you just say, no, I can't agree, and things ends in this, and there is no no continuing in. You do not continue the sessions anymore, just by saying no. Sorry, I don't agree to your terms. These are my terms, and they are non-negotiable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would say it that way exactly, because I think that, I mean, what I hear in the way that you're expressing it is that, you're really fed up and pissed off. And I would like to think that before I got to that point of showing someone the door, I would have been able to, I would have tried to express in a kind of fuller way, in a fuller voice, what trouble I'm having with it. And absolutely, I have, as I said, I think for most analysts, things change over time. Your needs change, your attitudes about the work change, the amount of time you have changes, and how much money you want to make changes, and all kinds of things change that shift some of those, shift the way we are with patients. And at this point, I charge a higher fee than I used to. I charge a fairly high fee by the standards even of New York psychologists, and I have very little time. So if someone can't afford my fee, I don't work with them. If I'm in the midst of work with them and something happens that changes, once I'm committed to the work, I tend to work with more elasticity that way. For example, I'll tell you something that, getting to the COVID-19 thing. A lot of analysts in New York found, among all of the topsy-turvy things happening in relation to how you can see a patient and those aspects of the setting, suddenly the patient is in your house, you're in the patient's house, you're seeing bits of their rooms as I'm seeing bits of your rooms, and you're seeing a bit of my room. And so, all kinds of things have been altered during this period of time, including patients who have had, serious financial reversals. And so I felt that I wouldn't end the treatment over a financial reversal in the context of this scenario. It just felt wrong to me. It didn't feel ethical.
Tony,
but I had two patients. What did you say, Sharon?
If you can give some examples of how you handled it or how it happened. Okay.
Yeah, I was just about to. So
okay,
I was about to mention two patients. One patient, then he also had gotten COVID-19, so was quite ill, and at the same time that it emerged that his firm was collapsing, and he was going to be in significant debt because of a loan that the partners of the firm had taken out in relation to their offices. And so he was worried about not only suddenly going from making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to being in debt, and he felt that he had to stop his analysis. And and this was, he had just gotten over the kind of worst of his COVID illness. And I said that I felt that I wouldn't want to have him stop. So abruptly. You know, I felt that we needed time to think about it, to think about what had happened, to consider possibilities. You know, I felt that we could use some time to see what would unfold. And he said, you know, that he felt that he couldn't accept my offer. He felt too ashamed, you know, to essentially have sessions for no money, if that was what was required, as we had a chance to think together about what might be possible. And so he ended the sessions quite abruptly, saying that when I was back in the office, he would like to come in for a few months to you know, quote, terminate, you know, to end our sessions. But he didn't want to do that over the phone. He didn't want to do that on Zoom. It felt too personal. So that was one experience in which I offered to be as flexible could be, and my patient couldn't take me up on it, at least at that point. I don't know what will happen when I'm back in the office and we're talking again. Maybe something will be different, but that's how it looked. In the case of another patient, I see she also is in a business that was knocked for a loop. She owns her own business. She said, I just can't, I don't have any money. They were in the middle of renovating a new apartment that was paid for by her very successful business. And she was in real trouble, didn't want to stop, felt, you know, very upset at the prospect of stopping because she couldn't pay. And with her, I made a kind of, we came to, in sort of exploring stopping, how she was thinking about it, how she was thinking about her business, how she was feeling about the prospect of stopping. We came up with something that I think is a very unusual arrangement, which is that, you know, that I felt, knowing her and the kind of businesswoman she is, I felt that I could understand how anxious she was feeling about it under these circumstances, and tremendous amount of uncertainty that she was, and we all are suffering, but that given the whole picture, I felt that for her to simply stop analysis, it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like it was something that I wanted to have defined and forced by her inability to pay my fee at this particular moment. So we came up with the following plan, which was that I would see her for half the fee that she was paying, but that I felt that within, 6 months, her business would be going great guns again. And if that were the case, if she continued to be successful in her business, which I believe that she will, because she's a brilliant business person, then she would pay me back for the other half we would keep track. Essentially, it would be like a kind of forgivable loan. And if over the course of the next 6 months, her business was back in business and she was really earning a lot of money again, she would pay the full fee. And if that wasn't the case, if the business, didn't come back and if she were not back in financial good condition, then I would simply have charged her half the fee. So that was, for me, a kind of example of a certain kind of elasticity. It wasn't entirely giving in. Mm-hmm. It was trying to make it possible for her to continue on the sort of premise that I believed that this would work out, and we'll see how it unfolds. I mean, I don't know how it will unfold. If she continues only to be able to pay half, that will be something that we'll probably think about over the next number of months and
Tony,
see. Yeah.
Why do you think it's so embarrassing for therapists to raise money issues with their patients? And I want to remind you what Freud said about it. He said, money matters are treated by civilized people in the same way as sexual matters.
Yeah.
And the same inconsistency, prudishness, and hypocrisy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that most analysts in the last 20 or 30 years would probably say that money has topped sex as a difficult thing to talk about. I mean, I think, at least in the United States, I think patients are much more comfortable talking about the details of their sex life and masturbation life and masturbation fantasies and much more forthrightly than the details of money.
And how do you understand it? Why? How do you understand this?
Well, I think that I think like everything else, there's no singular one-size-fits-all solution. But I think that money, at least in capitalistic societies, and in a society like the United States, especially maybe. I've never really talked about this with people from other capitalistic societies. But I think within the United States, there's a combination of shame surrounding money. There's a sense of more shame about on sort of either side, right? Like shame if you feel like you're not doing well financially, and shame on the other side if you're doing too well, and you might be perceived as greedy, or you might be perceived, you might be envied, and so I have found perhaps more on the latter, on the second side. Actually, I think when I work with patients who are quite wealthy, I notice they're more comfortable, as I say, talking about very intimate details, sexual details, other very intimate things, quite openly, with relatively little embarrassment, compared to if you say something like, well, how much do you make? Or, how much did you spend on that house? Or something, where there's something, whether it has to do with as I said, fear of the therapist's envy or something like that. I think that's from the patient side. I think from the therapist side, there are probably similar complementary, aspects that obtain, either having to do with, the analyst's envy of the patient. So often, at least here, at least for senior analysts in a place like New York, most of our patients are far wealthier than we are, far more successful in the world of economy. And so I think that analysts also get stirred up in terms of sort of their own envy, their own shame around.
Yes, and it reminds me what Muriel Demon said about that in her paper about money, that analysts are uncomfortable with their own feelings of need and greed.
Yeah, both need and greed, and both And I think to say that we're uncomfortable with it is probably an understatement. I mean, I think that there's a great deal of shame, that surrounds it, and and envy is one of those two-headed monsters, that it's very it's very uncomfortable, painful, disturbing to be on either side, right, of the envy transaction, right? I don't know if it's worse to be envied or to envy, but they're both awful. And so I think that talking about money more than sex stirs up those kinds of dynamics. I mean, I've had, I tend to, as following Freud's dictum, to be very blunt and forthright in inquiring in the context of something that's being discussed, whether it's sex or money, and I've been rebuffed more in asking about money than in asking about sex. If there's a context in which I'm interested in what they were thinking about when they were masturbating or what their fantasies were, I rarely have a patient says, well, why do you want to know that? But if I say, well, so how much money did you make last year? They'll say, well, why do you want to know that? Like there's much more anxiety and sort of pushback, and patients genuinely being quite anxious about why one would want to know. Is it maybe a fear of their own exhibitionism, or what am I trying to look for and find in them? And so oftentimes I think there's quite a bit of work that takes place around those transactions in terms of what is happening in the psyche of the therapist and the patient.
Well, I think what people want to know more about how New York analysts deal with their patients in this coronavirus crisis. It seems that the virus dictated that the picture does not fit the frame anymore. The external reality dictates it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the external reality dictates a lot, at times of crisis and times of overwhelm. But it certainly, analysts have dealt with this, forever. I mean, as Mike Eigen mentioned when he was here a couple of weeks ago, Freud had to hightail it out of Vienna to escape the Nazis, and many of your parents and grandparents were in similar situations in which they were able to get out or weren't able to get out, and there were analysts who were and were not able to get out, who perished in the Holocaust. It's not the first time we're dealing with enormous threats to our lives, to our lives, both in the sense of living and dying, and also our lives as we live them. And there have been, since psychoanalysis emerged as a thing in the early 1900s, there have been many places in which analysts and patients have been under threat, and have been under threat together, in South American dictatorships. And we heard a lot about this in our IARP meeting in Chile in terms of what people were going through. People disappearing, therapists and patients disappearing. And it's happening again now. Patients and therapists are disappearing, they're dying, they're sort of offline in one way or another. And so I think that's part of the very painful, challenging reality that we're facing, whether we're therapist or patient in any given role setting. I mean, I'm very aware when I talk to analysts, when I talk to you, you know, I'm very aware that, you know, all of us either are now, probably many of us are now, patients as much as analysts, and we've all, for much of our lives, been patients for years, and also analysts. So I think, you know, the common thread is our being human beings, whichever role we're occupying in any given moment. You know, many of my patients are analysts, and I'm very aware that you know, in this particular, many of my patients are analysts who I could just as well be in analysis with as they could be in analysis with me. And so I think, you know, which role one occupies is somewhat incidental in a way. I mean, it's not incidental in the sense that the role carries with it certain responsibilities and functions, but, you know, particularly when we're undergoing these kinds of strains as we're going through now, it's not predetermined who's more in danger, who's more threatened, who's more disorganized, who's more struggling, and so I think that that's one thing that becomes outed in a time like this. You know, that whether you're the therapist or you're the patient, you're exposed in a certain kind of way, right? I mean, one thing that's exposed is our mortality, you know, our being mortals, as Gianni Nebbiosi expresses so beautifully, that's the thing about us. You know, we're all mortals, and so we're all facing our end, you know, sooner or later. And I think in these kinds of situations, it's brought forward in a very dramatic way that we're under threat, where we don't feel safe. We're undergoing losses. We're undergoing losses of loved ones, of jobs, of money, and so I think there is that kind of exposure that I think is not an unhelpful thing to be undergoing together. You know, I would prefer it to be under other circumstances, but I think that that we're seeing each other more completely. And a patient of mine, a very smart patient of mine, said this past week, he said, well, the thing about, because in New York everybody's wearing masks, and he says, you know, the thing about everybody's wearing masks now that I kind of enjoy is that at least now you can see their mask. You know, that it's right out there, you know, and in regular life, we don't really, you know, we see what we think is a face, but oftentimes that face has a mask as well, and something that's covering what a person really feels and what a person really thinks. And so even as we're wearing our masks in a certain kind of way in therapy, we're even more unmasked than ever because our vulnerability is being exposed.
As people in the audience share that now, if the therapist is older, his vulnerability is much more emphasized in relation to the patient. So some kind of, there can be kind of shift in the vulnerability in the diet.
Well, that's right. I mean, it brings it out. I mean, that's the kind of thing I noticed when Mike Eigen was speaking here a couple of weeks ago. He made the point, you know, maybe it was slightly defensive or self-protective, as true as it is. I mean, he made the point, well, young people are dying too. You know, I think that's what you know, that's something that an older person might say to reassure himself, you know, like it's not only older people that are dying. But, you know, I think the fact is older people are more vulnerable to dying not only of COVID-19, but of everything else. And that's something that...
But the situation brings it to the front of our consciousness.
Exactly. And I think it's something that oftentimes is dissociated by both the therapist and the patient, because, you know, the therapist doesn't like to think about dying, and patients don't like to think about us dying either, because usually, you know, they love us, among other things.
And you found that in the sessions, mortality was more discussed lately?
Quite directly, you know, and I mean, patients quite directly say, you know, I'm worried about you. And they also, I mean, one thing that's been quite interesting, I'm sure you've experienced this too, is that, you know, the way that people, well, what do people say in greeting in Israel, aside from shalom? Or, I mean, are there particular idioms that are sort of like,
yeah, like,
how are you doing? Or like, you know,
Manishma, how are you?
How are you? Yeah, like here, it's just a kind of almost formal, someone come in the session, how are you? Fine. Then it kind of moves from there. It's like a kind of formal, almost like a kind of tick. It's not a real question. Mm-hmm. But I think now it's a real question. You know, now people are really concerned about how you are. And I think for both the therapist and the patient, that's no longer just a kind of formality to be kind of ignored and gotten over into the real session. I think that very often sessions are more likely to start with some version of, mm-hmm. How are you doing? And it's a real question.
Tony,
yeah.
Since our time is limited, I would like to raise some issues or questions that are coming from the audience, and
great.
Some I have. I will say a few questions, and you will see what you are reflecting on. Okay. One is, what do you think how psychoanalysis and psychotherapy? It's too early to know, but what is your feeling or estimation? What is going to be changed? Are we going to get back into what we were, or what will be the change that you feel is coming? Do you think trauma will find more trauma, or trauma is trauma central? Is central to the experience of the corona, or it's too maybe it's not so traumatic. Maybe it's overgeneralization to call it trauma. If around the setting, when the corona will be over, would you offer patients who would like to continue on Zoom? Will it be their choice, your choice, the dyad choice?
Yeah, those are all great questions. I mean, I would like to respond to each of them. They were all excellent questions, but since I'm not taking notes and I don't know that I can...
I remind you, okay.
Can you just ask them one by one, and I'll respond briefly.
So what will be changed?
As far as the psychoanalytic situation and mm-hmm. setting and so on goes, mm-hmm. You mean? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's impossible to tell yet, and I think that will vary by area also. You know, I think that a lot of analysts in New York are really, extremely uncertain about when it would be possible to return to business as usual, because there's so many people here and so many patients come to see us on subways, which are very hot spots. And, you know, there's a lot of talk on my various psychoanalytic institute listservs about the sort of the ethics of all of this, even aside from potential danger to ourselves. Mm-hmm. How do we sort of deal with patients coming and lying on the couch or sitting on the chair and having another patient come in 5 minutes later? How much time is there really to disinfect things? What if we have a patient who catches COVID from another patient who had sneezed as they were on the couch or on a chair, and that patient got very sick or died.
Or if the therapist sneezes.
Yep, exactly. So I think that that people are really agnostic at this point to the question of, when it could be possible to be back together, close at hand in the office. So I expect that to be something that will, we're all really uncertain about. People are dealing with it at the level of being out of their offices, which we're paying expensive rents for months.
But do you think that when the pandemic will be over, hopefully, the flexibility that we are all practice now, because now you have to be relational and flexible because the situation forces you to be, but would this flexibility remain central practice, negotiating with the patient what he prefers, what's good for him, what's good for the dyad, or will we go back to more rigid formats of settings?
I think I would be surprised if we went back. Well, first of all, it's a question of who's the we, right? Yeah. Like there was an old joke, and I don't know if this joke, one would get it outside of the United States, but are people familiar with the old Lone Ranger television show? Do you know who the Lone Ranger was? Well, you won't get the joke then. But there's different sets of we's. So as Anair said, there's the classical we's and there's the relational we's, and all kinds of different we's who I think will have different responses. I think everyone will be somewhat affected and changed by this, but how much flexibility people will be open to as a function of what we're learning now remains to be seen. I expect to be more flexible than I was before. I mean, I've always done a certain amount of work on phone or Zoom. I've treated people from different countries. I've done a lot of supervision of people from around the world. So it's always been a not insignificant subset of the work that I do. And now, as a function of what's taken place, I'm seeing people, in the New York area more that, I'm seeing everybody that way now, but I could envision having more hours in these kinds of formats than I had before. And for people for whom it just, works better, or they're needing supervision and they live in Brooklyn or even treatment in some cases. I hadn't thought, for example, when this started, and this is, the speed of the adaptation of this is so, everything has happened so fast. It's unbelievable. As I think you said when we were starting, the level of adaptation that we have, that we're doing things that would have seemed unimaginable. And when this started just 6 weeks ago, or 2 months ago, about 6 weeks ago since I've been out of my office, I told patients who were I had one patient, aside from the ones that I mentioned, who decided to pause No, two patients. One new patient who decided to wait until I was back in the office, and another patient who wanted to wait until I was back in the office. And at the time, I said that, I explored with them why they felt that they didn't want to try to meet in these ways in the interim, and discussed it a little, but they didn't want to do it. And at the time, I said, well, I don't expect to take on new patients while this is going on. So it's okay with me. I'll hold the hours for you. And they said, well, let me know if that changes. Because I don't want to give up my hours, but I don't want to pay for sessions that I'm not using for, some unspecified period of time. And so that felt reasonable to me under the circumstances.
Yes.
But now, after 6 weeks, my feelings have changed about it. I recently got a call from a person, and another analyst who wanted to start treatment and wanted to start it this way. And I agreed to do it. And before taking her on, I got in touch with my patients who I had told them I was going to hold their hours. And I said, things are changing. Do you want to consider coming in the meantime? Or if not, I don't know that I'll have your hours, or we'll be able to find something right away.
So it's ongoing process.
Say again?
It is an ongoing process.
An ongoing process, yeah. And and I feel like if this thing lasted, another 6 months before people could get back into their office, probably I would take on other patients this way, that I'm meeting for the first time in a Zoom room or something like that. But I don't know. I don't know that everybody, has moved quite in the same way yet.
Anna?
Yeah, well, we are at the end of our conversation. It's thought-provoking and so interesting. Let me just ask you a question that I'm always curious about that has nothing to do with the coronavirus. When reading case studies and clinical vignettes of American relational analysts like yours, they sound quite different from the patients of British object relation therapists. They sound more verbal, more organized, less regressed, less disturbed, also financially stable. I was thinking whether these are different groups of patients with different characteristics, for example, that maybe they are less disturbed and less regressed, or maybe it is how they are described by different analysts, and that's what makes the difference. Different narratives make different patients. Yeah. But same population. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think both things that you said are true. I mean, I think that vignettes are meant to illustrate something, and so British independents and Kleinians are trying to illustrate psychotic processes and early regressed phenomenon. So I think that they select. I don't think that those are constitute their whole practices any more than any of the vignettes I use constitute my whole practice. So I think one has to keep in mind that, case vignettes always are serving a purpose to advance a certain kind of theory. But I also, and also differences in technique and differences in stance co-establishes different kinds of patients. It's been an interesting thing, knowing so many of the authors, both in the British school and the American relational school, because I've been involved in this for 40 years and was very close to very close to Steve Mitchell and Manny Gent and many of the writers in the relational school. And I've gotten to know many of the British independents because we've had conferences together and crossovers of our work. And one thing that you notice, you've probably seen it among your colleagues who write, is that you can really see the person in the patient. That when you read, people have talked about this classically too. You know, if you read Freud and Jung and Ferencz's cases, all of which were taking place around the same time, you know, Freud gets Freudian patients and Jung gets Jungian patients, and Ferenczi gets certain kinds of patients that are associated with Ferenczi. And they partly, I think, mirror, you know, the personality of the analyst. I find this oftentimes when I read great writers, like if you read Tom Ogden's work, you know, he's a phenomenal writer. He's a brilliant writer, but I always feel that his patients reflect Ogden. You know, there's something about the way he describes his patients that I feel constitutes, you know, they're responding to Ogden. So it's as though you can see, and similarly when you read Steve Mitchell, you know, there's something about the patients that feel like a blend of who the patient might be and who the analyst is, which makes sense because, you know, the patient is talking to that analyst. You know, it reminds me of that story. I don't know if you remember this story that Steve Mitchell told in one of his essays about how when his wife, Margaret, once for his birthday bought him a sitting with a wonderful portrait artist. Do you remember this story?
Mm-hmm.
And they had seen some of his work, and it was terrific work. And Margaret thought that she would like, and she thought Steve would like, a portrait done by this wonderful guy. And he shows up, and the guy's a complete bore. You know, he's just a very narcissistic character, and he's talking, and in a way that Steve found quite unpleasant. And then when the portrait was delivered, Steve looked at himself and said, "Oh my God, do I look like that? I mean, that's a horrible portrait. I can't believe it." And Margaret said, "Yeah, that's what you look like when you're in the presence of a really narcissistic, boring person." So, you know, the portrait, which was unfortunately spoiled, was, you know, the portrait of the subject responding to the artist. And I think oftentimes what we see is the kind of portrait of the subject responding to us, mm-hmm. which is why I think it's helpful. And as Ferenczi said so beautifully, and which I've repeated many times, less beautifully than Ferenczi wrote it, you know, that many times we have to realize that that we're looking at the patient who's looking at us. And so if we don't know, if we can't take in and take seriously and apprehend that what we're seeing is partly a reflection of ourselves, and to be interested in that reflection, to be interested in what they're seeing, not just as a way of fishing for transference, but as a way of finding out, you know, who we're seeing in them seeing us. And the more we can see us, the more we can see what they're seeing, and therefore the more they can be comfortable showing us who they are. Mm-hmm. You know, that's I think how the analysis proceeds. And that's what never happens if you say to a patient, "I think you're unsuitable for analysis." You never learn, you know, you find out what the patient, you know who finds out what the patient thought of you when you said that? The next analyst who they go to. And say, "I saw this guy and he said I wasn't suitable for analysis, and this is what I thought of him." And so, you know, that it's a great thing about our profession that we have the chance to keep learning about ourselves as well as learning about the work.
Thank you, Tony, for this inspiring conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure.
I would like to share with you that the audience is very thankful for the honesty and openness, and for sharing your shred of thoughts in these challenging times.
Thank you.
And as one
if you open the chat, you can see some of the comments right now.
Okay, yeah. You know, the only thing that would make this better, and I know it's impossible, but if it were ever possible to do something like this, where people could actually, you know, when you were reading their question, or, you know, if they could ask the question, that would be great. Or if when you were reading the question, they could be sort of highlighted. So, you know, because apropos what I'm saying, then it's so different if you know who you're talking to.
Sure.
You know, it's such a more personal kind of
engagement. You know, paradoxically, in relation to live conferences, which we participate all our life, here many more people comment. Well, usually there is 1 or 2 or 3 comments.
Right. Well, that's a good paradox.
So,
yeah.
So
yeah.
there is also advantage of there is need less courage to share. But
yeah, that's a good point. But I feel a loss of having, you know, I see about 20 faces, and so I feel the loss of having not seen the other 200 faces that were present for some part of this.
And what people wrote is one of them. I think it reflects some of the essential feedback is that what was very evident is that you strongly hold your inner frame and the deep therapeutic processes, and that's what enable you to negotiate the formal or the more pragmatic aspects of therapy, because inside yourself you have a strong frame of what is psychoanalysis or what is psychotherapy. And
yeah, I feel extremely well seen then, because that feels right to me, and I think it you know, it's sort of there was a great paper by Manny Gant that really captures something about psychoanalysis. He called it paradox and process, and he said that the paradox can't be resolved, but it becomes understood in process. So I think whoever made that comment is right. I think that some of what can look like a kind of hyper flexibility is modulated by an inner sense that I have, in which my inner frame is well established. So I think that was a very good pickup by whoever.
And also if someone like you, who is a seminal contributor to the relational thought and very experienced analyst, is learning the situation and move with the motions and is not sure what is going to be the next step. So we all feel better about the uncertainty.
Well, that's good.
It's not only attributed to our personal limitations, but to the general uncertainty.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's so important to recognize that if you weren't feeling in a state of uncertainty, you should go back into analysis and find out why.
That's a great statement.
And yeah, I wish I had more time to play with questions more and to answer all the questions, but I understand that we have a time frame and you guys are in the evening. So I wish you all good night.
We appreciate so much that you share with us your experience and thought and devoted time for this talk. Anna?
It was my honor. I mean, to have people interested in what's on your mind, what could be better than that? So thank you.
Thank you, and take care.
Thanks very much. You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Sharon.